In the 6 months after December 7th, 1941, the Empire of Japan was unstoppable. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not an isolated event. It was the opening move of a terrifying continent-spanning blitzkrieg. The Japanese military, backed by the most powerful navy in the world, swept across the Pacific with a speed and ferocity that stunned the Allies. Hong Kong fell. Singapore, the impregnable British fortress, fell. The Philippines fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. The seemingly invincible British battleships, Prince of Wales and Repulse, were sent to the bottom of the ocean in a matter of hours. And the symbol of this new, terrifying dominance was a single machine. It was an aircraft so advanced, so beautiful, and so deadly that Allied pilots who faced it were convinced it was a myth. They called it the Zero. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was, without exaggeration, the finest carrier-based fighter in the world. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a perfect balance of speed, agility, and, most critically, range. It could fly over 2,000 miles on a single tank of fuel. It could climb like a rocket. And in a dogfight, it could turn on a dime. Allied pilots, flying their rugged, heavy, and suddenly obsolete American P-40 Warhawks and Navy F6F Wildcats, were in a state of shock. Their reports back to command were desperate and filled with disbelief. They would get a Zero in their gun sights, fire, and the Zero would simply perform an impossible climbing turn and disappear. Then, in a flash, the Zero would be behind them, its 20mm cannons, not machine guns, but cannons, ripping their wings off. The kill ratios were catastrophic. 10 Allied planes were being shot down for every one Zero. The Zero had become a legend, a super weapon. American and British pilots were given a simple, terrifying order. Do not, under any circumstances, try to dogfight a Zero. If you see one, your only option is to dive and to run. The Allies were losing the air war because they were fighting a ghost. They had no answer to the Zero because they didn't understand it. They had captured a few wrecks, blasted and burned, from the beaches of Pearl Harbor and the jungles of the Philippines. But they had no intact model. They had no idea how it was built. What was its engine like? How much horsepower did it have? How was it so light? What was its armor like? Allied intelligence was desperate. They guessed it was a copy of a Western design. They guessed it had a massive engine. All their guesses were wrong. They knew with chilling certainty that they could not beat the Zero until they could fly one. But the Japanese were under strict orders. Any Zero pilot whose plane was damaged was to crash it into the enemy or destroy it upon landing. They were forbidden from letting this sacred weapon fall into enemy hands. The Allies were trapped. They needed a miracle. They needed a perfectly intact Zero to fall from the sky, in a place where they could actually recover it. The chances were zero. And then, on June 4th, 1942, in the middle of a frozen, fog-covered, and completely forgotten corner of the world, the miracle happened. This miracle was a direct consequence of the Battle of Midway, the most decisive naval battle of the entire war. But what most people don't know is that Midway was not a single, isolated battle. The Japanese plan for Midway was a massive, complex operation, and it included a Phase 2. While the main Japanese fleet, under Admiral Nagumo, was attacking Midway Atoll, a second, smaller Japanese fleet, under Admiral Kakuta, was sailing north. Their mission was to attack the Aleutian Islands, the long, remote chain of volcanic islands that belonged to Alaska. The Japanese goal was twofold. First, they believed this attack on American soil would be a diversion, pulling the US Navy's aircraft carriers away from Midway, where Nagumo's main fleet could then ambush and destroy them. Second, they intended to capture the western Aleutian islands of Attu and Kiska to create a defensive barrier that would make it impossible for the United States to ever attack Japan from Alaska. On June 3rd, 1942, one day before the main battle of Midway, this northern fleet launched its attack. Planes from the Japanese carriers Ryujo and Junyo took off. Their target, the tiny, primitive, and completely fogged-in American base at Dutch Harbor. The Japanese pilots, who were used to fighting over the tropical islands of the Pacific, were now in a pilot's nightmare. The weather in the Aleutians was and is the worst in the world. The fog, or willy-waw, was so thick that pilots couldn't see their own wingtips. The first raid on Dutch Harbor was a confused, scattered failure. The next day, June 4th, as the main fleet at Midway was sailing into disaster, the Northern Fleet tried again. They launched a second, larger strike on Dutch Harbor. This time, the American anti-aircraft gunners were ready. The sky was full of flak, and as the Japanese Zeros were strafing the harbor, a flight of American P-40 Warhawk fighters, which had been hiding at a secret, camouflaged airfield, appeared from the fog. A chaotic, swirling dogfight began in the clouds over the harbor. Leading one of the Japanese Zero units was a 19-year-old Flight Petty Officer First Class, Tadayoshi Koga. Koga was an ace. He was a veteran, a skilled pilot from the carrier Ryujo. He was flying a brand new, pristine Mitsubishi A6M20, serial number 4593. During the dogfight, Koga's Zero was hit. The American pilots in the air and the gunners on the ground all claimed the kill. But what they all saw was that Koga's plane was damaged. It began to trail a thin, white stream of smoke. This was not a fatal hit. It was not on fire. It had not exploded. But one of the American bullets had done something very specific. It had severed the oil line. Petty Officer Koga, seeing his oil pressure gauge drop to 0, knew he had only a few minutes before his engine would seize. He was too far from his carrier, the Ryujo, to make it back. So he did exactly what his emergency procedures briefing had told him to do. He was to fly to a designated emergency landing zone, a small, uninhabited island just 25 miles east of Dutch Harbor, Akutan Island. His briefing told him the island was flat, grassy, and perfect for a belly landing. He could land his plane, destroy it with his service pistol, and then wait to be rescued by a Japanese submarine that was already assigned to the area. He banked his smoking plane away from the fight. His 2 wingmen followed him to protect him as he went down. Koga lined up his approach over Akutan. He saw what he thought was a smooth, green, grassy field. It was perfect. He lowered his landing gear. This was his fatal mistake. He should have bellied in, landing on the smooth metal underside of his plane, but the field looked so good, so smooth, that he decided to perform a normal landing. His 2 wingmen watched from above as their ace pilot, Tadayoshi Koga, flew his invincible Zero straight into a trap, because the smooth green field was not a field. It was muskeg. It was a deep, waterlogged Arctic swamp. The moment Koga's wheels touched the grass, they dug in. The 3 million yen invincible superweapon instantly and violently flipped over onto its back. The plane was stuck, nose down, in the deep mud. His two wingmen, circling above, could only watch in horror. They had strict orders to destroy any downed Zero to prevent its capture. They circled and they waited. They expected to see Koga climb out, wave, and then set his plane on fire. But Koga did not climb out. In the low-speed, gentle crash, the 19-year-old pilot, hanging upside down in his straps, had been killed instantly. His neck was broken. The two wingmen now had a terrible choice. Their ace was dead. The plane was intact. Their orders were destroy it. But they could not bring themselves to do it. They could not strafe the wreck, and in doing so, riddle their dead comrade's body with machine gun fire. They made a fateful emotional decision. They convinced themselves that the plane, flipped over and sinking in a remote, uninhabited swamp, would never be found. They circled one last time, and they flew away. For 5 long weeks. They were right. The Akutan Zero, the single most important war prize of the Pacific, sat upside down in a remote swamp, lost. And the US Navy had no idea it was even there. For 5 long, agonizing weeks, the Akutan Zero sat upside down in the remote Arctic swamp. The body of Petty Officer Koga was still strapped inside. The single most valuable intelligence prize of the Pacific War was sinking, lost, under fog and freezing water, and it would have been lost forever, if not for a routine, grindingly dull US Navy patrol. On July 10th, 1942, a PBY Catalina flying boat, a slow, rugged, long-range patrol bomber, was doing what it did every day. It was flying a low-level search pattern over the endless, grey islands of the Aleutians, looking for any sign of the Japanese fleet. The pilot of the Catalina was Lieutenant William Bill Thies. He and his crew were flying just beneath the cloud cover, scanning the green and grey tundra of Akutan Island. The fog, which the locals called a willy war, was so thick they were in constant danger of flying directly into a mountain. Suddenly, the radio man, sitting in the side blister window, shouted. He had seen something. It was not a ship. It was not a submarine. It was just a glint of something, red. Lieutenant Thies, his curiosity piqued, banked the big, clumsy Catalina around for another pass. This was dangerous. He dropped the plane even lower. The fog broke for just a few seconds, and then they saw it. It was not just something red. It was the Hinomaru, the red meatball insignia of the Japanese Empire. It was on the wing of an aircraft that was flipped completely upside down, its landing gear sticking straight up into the air, like the legs of a dead insect. Thies knew exactly what this was. This was a Zero, and it wasn't a wreck. It wasn't burned. It wasn't riddled with bullets. From the air, it looked perfect. He immediately radioed his base at Dutch Harbor. The message was electric. A downed Zero, wheels up, appeared to be intact on Akutan Island. The US Navy Command, who had been desperate for any scrap of information on this mythical plane, was ecstatic. A salvage team was immediately assembled, led by Lieutenant Robert Kermsey. Kermsey and his team arrived on Akutan a day later. Getting to the wreck was a nightmare in itself. They had to trek for miles, carrying heavy gear through the muskeg. This was not solid ground. It was a cold, deep, ankle-sucking swamp. And then they found it. It was exactly as Thies had reported. The pristine silver plane was half submerged in the freezing muddy water. The cockpit was completely underwater. They waded in. They reached into the submerged cockpit, and they made their first grim discovery. They found the body of Petty Officer Koga still hanging from his straps. They carefully cut the young pilot free and, with respect, buried his body in a shallow grave on the tundra. Then they turned to the plane. Kerms's men, who had never seen a Zero up close, were stunned. It was so light. The aluminum skin felt thin. They searched the cockpit and found Koga's logbook, his charts, and his papers, identifying him and his carrier, the Ryujo. But they also found that the plane was stuck. It was stuck, deep, in a suction of mud. Their first attempts to move it were a failure. They attached ropes and tried to use their small team to roll it over. It wouldn't budge. It just sank deeper. Kerms radioed back to Dutch Harbor with a simple, desperate message. The plane is intact, but it is sinking. We need heavy equipment. We need tractors. We need a crane, now. This is where the real impossible problem began. Akutan Island was not just remote. It was primitive. It had no roads. It had no docks. It had no cranes. The US Navy salvage teams, who were masters of pulling sunken ships from harbors, had no idea how to pull a 5,000-pound delicate piece of aluminum out of a swamp on an island in the middle of a war zone. Their first plan was to bring in caterpillars or heavy tractors. A recovery ship was sent, but it couldn't get close to the island. The water was too shallow. They couldn't land the heavy tractors. The beach was just a muddy bog. The plan failed. The second attempt was brute force. They decided they would drag the Zero 2 miles across the muskeg to a solid beach on the other side of the island. This operation, which they thought would take a day, took weeks. The men lived in frozen tents. The work was brutal. They used every block and tackle, every winch, and every cable they had. The muskeg created a vacuum that would not let the plane go. Every time they pulled, the delicate wings and the thin aluminum fuselage would groan, twist, and oil can. The salvage team was in a panic. They were destroying the priceless intelligence prize just by trying to save it. Finally, after weeks of this back-breaking labor, they got the mud-caked, battered, but still intact wreck to a solid beach. But the impossible problem just changed. It was now sitting on the beach, but they couldn't lift it. There were no cranes. A conventional ship couldn't get close enough. This is where the engineers had their moment of Higgins boat-style genius. They built a massive crude sled, or skid, out of salvaged lumber. Using handjacks and winches, they painstakingly hoisted the 5,000-pound Zero onto this sled. Then they waited for the tide. They floated a shallow draft barge in as far as it would go. They waited for the tide to go out, which left the barge stranded on the sand, right next to the sled. Then, using steel rollers, logs, and every ounce of manpower they had, they slid the entire sled, with the Zero on it, sideways, onto the barge. They waited, again, for the next high tide. And finally, the barge floated. It was now late August 1942. It had taken almost 2 full months. Not to find the Zero, but just to get it off the island. The precious mud-covered wreck was taken, under armed guard, back to Dutch Harbor. It was unceremoniously but carefully loaded into the cargo hold of a freighter. It began its secret, 1,000-mile journey south, to the Naval Air Station at North Island, San Diego, California. The engineers, the pilots, and the intelligence officers of the US Navy were waiting. They had heard the myths from their terrified pilots for 6 months. They were about to finally touch the invincible ghost, and what they were about to discover would change the entire course of the air war. When the freighter carrying the Akutan Zero arrived at the North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego, the secrecy was absolute. The crate was unloaded under armed guard and taken to a secure, locked hangar. The men who opened it were the top engineers and test pilots of the US Navy. What they found inside was a sad, battered, and mud-caked Frankenstein's monster of an aircraft. The brutal 2-month recovery had bent its fuselage, crumpled its tail, and the engine was a frozen block of oxidized metal from being submerged in the swamp. It was not a plane, it was a kit. The first order of business was to rebuild it. This was a painstaking reverse engineering process. The plane was completely disassembled piece by piece. Every rivet was drilled out, every wire was tagged, every component was laid out on the hangar floor. And this is when the first stunning secrets of the invincible Zero were revealed. The first shock was the weight. The engineers knew the Zero was light, but they had no idea how light. When they weighed the components, their calculations were impossible. The Zero, fully loaded, weighed just 5,500 pounds. The US Navy's standard carrier fighter, the Grumman F4F Wildcat, weighed over 7,900 pounds. How had the Japanese built a frontline, carrier-based fighter that was over a ton lighter than its American equivalent? The answer was the second shock. The Zero had no armor. The American engineers, who were used to building their Wildcats like flying tanks, were horrified. The F4F Wildcat had thick steel armor plate behind the pilot's seat. It had bulletproof glass in the windscreen. It was designed to take a punch. The Zero had nothing. The pilot's seat was a thin, unarmored piece of aluminum. And then they found the real impossible secret. They cut into the wings, and they found no fuel tanks. The American Wildcat had self-sealing fuel tanks. These were a brilliant, heavy, layered rubber invention. When a bullet pierced the tank, the fuel would leak into the rubber, causing it to swell and instantly seal the hole, preventing a fire. The Zero had no self-sealing tanks. In fact, it had no tanks at all. The engineers realized, with a chill, that the entire, hollow, unarmored wing of the Zero was the gas tank. The skin of the wing was the wall of the fuel tank. This was the secret to its impossible range. It was, quite literally, a flying bomb. The Japanese engineers, led by their genius designer, Jiro Horikoshi, had made a deliberate, cultural and terrifying choice. They had sacrificed everything for performance. They had sacrificed armor. They had sacrificed self-sealing tanks. They had sacrificed pilot survivability, all for just two things: range and the ability to turn. The American engineers, for the first time, understood what they were fighting. This was not a superweapon. It was a glass cannon. It was a thoroughbred racehorse that was so fragile, a single well-placed bullet would cause it to disintegrate in a ball of flame. This discovery alone was a war-winning piece of intelligence. The order was flashed to the fleet: aim for the wings. Aim for the spot just outside the landing gear. That is where the fuel is. Do not just hit the Zero, ignite it. But the analysis wasn't over. The engineers in San Diego still had to fly it. The battered, bent airframe of the Akutan Zero was too damaged to be flown safely, but its parts were now the most valuable things on Earth. The Navy took another captured, but differently damaged Zero, and they cannibalized the two, creating a single, airworthy Frankenstein Zero. In September 1942, this rebuilt Zero, painted in US Navy blue and grey with American star insignia, was rolled onto the runway. The man given the impossible job of test flying the Ghost was Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders. Sanders climbed into the cockpit. The first thing he noted was its theatre of operations feel. The instruments were all in Japanese. The controls were light, like a toy. He started the engine, a 14-cylinder Sakai radial engine, and he took off. The American test pilots on the ground watched, silent, as the Akutan Zero climbed. It didn't just climb, it rocketed. It hoisted itself into the sky at a rate that made the American Wildcat look anemic. Then, Sanders began the dogfighting maneuvers, and the myth was confirmed. The Zero could turn on a dime. It could flip itself around in a loop-the-loop that was so tight the American Wildcat could not follow. It would stall out and fall from the sky just trying to keep up. This was the bad news. The myth was true. In a low-speed turning dogfight, the Zero was, and always would be, invincible. But then, Sanders pushed the plane faster, and this is when he discovered the secret flaw, the one that would win the war. As the Zero passed 200 knots, about 230 miles per hour, Sanders tried to roll the plane, and the controls froze. The Japanese, in their obsessive quest to make the plane light, had not made the ailerons, the control surfaces on the wings, strong enough. At high speeds, the wind blast was so powerful that it literally pinned the ailerons in place. The pilot, no matter how strong he was, could not move the control stick. The invincible dogfighter suddenly flew like a truck. Sanders, his heart pounding with discovery, then tried another, even more critical test. He pushed the nose of the Zero down. He pushed the control stick forward into a negative G dive, and in that instant, the 14-cylinder Sakai engine quit. Cough, sputter, silence. The float-type carburetor in the engine, which was a design the Americans had abandoned as obsolete years before, could not handle the negative G-force. The fuel was literally floating away from the engine's intake. The engine didn't just quit, it would drown in fuel. Sanders, in a silent plane, pulled the stick back into a positive G loop. The engine coughed and restarted. He had it. He had the cheat code. The Akutan Zero. The Ghost was non-invincible. It was a flawed, fragile, one-trick pony. And now the US Navy knew exactly how to kill it. The test flight report from Eddie Sanders was perhaps the single most important document of the entire Pacific War. It was an instruction manual on how to kill the invincible Ghost. This highly technical secret report was immediately simplified, copied, and rushed to every single Allied airbase and aircraft carrier in the Pacific. For the first time, American and Australian pilots were not just being told, "run away." They were being given a specific, technical, and lethal cheat code. The new orders were simple, and they were based directly on the flaws discovered in the Akutan Zero. First, do not follow a Zero in a slow-speed turning dogfight. You will lose. Second, do not follow a Zero in a steep climb. It will outclimb you. But third, and this was the golden rule, if you are above 200 knots or in a dive, roll. The Zero's controls will freeze. You can roll away from it, and it cannot follow you. And fourth, if a Zero is on your tail, push your stick forward. Go into a negative G dive. The Zero's engine will sputter or quit entirely, and it will be unable to follow you. This was the defensive solution. It was how to survive an encounter. But the Akutan Zero also provided the offensive solution. This was developed by a brilliant US Navy squadron commander named John Jimmy Thach. Thach had already watched his pilots get slaughtered by the Zero, and even before the Akutan Zero was found, he had developed a theory on a blackboard, a what-if tactic. His idea was a beam defense maneuver where two American Wildcats would fly, side by side. When a Zero got on the tail of the first Wildcat, that pilot would signal, and both American planes would, at the same instant, turn toward each other. This weave would do two things. First, it would force the Zero, which was following the first plane, to suddenly overshoot the turn. Second, and more critically, it would present the Zero directly in front of the guns of the second American plane. It was an interlocking, mutually defensive scissors tactic. It was known, famously, as the Thach Weave. The problem was that it was just a theory. He didn't know if the Zero could be fooled in this way. Then, the Akutan Zero data arrived. The data proved that Thach's theory was correct. It proved that the Zero, with its incredible turning ability, could not roll fast enough at high speed to counter this weave. The Thach Weave was immediately adopted as the standard defensive tactic for the entire US Navy. But the biggest impact of the Akutan Zero was not on the pilots. It was on the engineers. Back in New York, at the Grumman Aircraft Factory, engineers were in a desperate race. They were already working on the successor to the F4F Wildcat. It was a new, bigger, more powerful plane, codenamed the F6F Hellcat. But before the Akutan Zero was captured, they were designing this plane in the dark. They were guessing at the Zero's speed, its climb rate, its weaknesses. Now, with the Akutan data, they didn't have to guess. They knew. The engineers at Grumman were given the exact performance specifications of their enemy, and they designed the Hellcat specifically to exploit every single fatal flaw. The F6F Hellcat was the anti-Zero. It was the complete opposite of the Japanese design. The Hellcat was not light. It was a monster. It was a 12,000-pound brute, built around the most powerful engine of the war, the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp. And it was built like a Grumman, which meant it was built like a tank. It had thick steel armor plate all around the pilot. It had a bulletproof windscreen. And most importantly, it had self-sealing fuel tanks. The Grumman design team deliberately sacrificed the turning ability that the Zero worshipped. Instead, they focused only on the Akutan weaknesses. They gave the Hellcat a massive supercharged engine that would give it a superior rate of climb at high altitude. They gave it an obscene top speed in a dive. And most critically, they gave it powerful hydraulic high-speed ailerons. The Hellcat could roll. The result was a machine that was designed specifically for the new Thach Weave and the boom and zoom tactic. An American pilot, in his new Hellcat, would never dogfight a Zero. He would use his superior engine to climb above the Zeros. He would then dive on them, a boom, at 400 miles per hour. He would use his new high-speed, Akutan-inspired roll rate to get his 6 50 caliber heavy machine guns on target. He would fire a single 1-second burst. igniting the Zero's unarmored flying bomb wing tanks. And then he would just keep diving. He would zoom away. The Zero, whose engine would quit if it tried to negative G dive, and whose controls would freeze if it tried to roll at high speed, could not follow. It was not a dogfight. It was a clinical, technical execution. In 1943, the first of the new F6F Hellcats arrived in the Pacific. They were loaded onto the new Essex-class carriers, and they were flown by pilots who had all been trained in the new religion, the religion of boom and zoom, the religion that had been written by the Akutan Zero. The invincible ghost was about to meet the monster that had been designed specifically to kill it. The confrontation that the Akutan Zero had engineered finally happened on June 19th, 1944. It was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but it would go down in history by the nickname the American pilots gave it that day, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese Navy, in a desperate, last-ditch decisive battle plan, threw everything it had at the American fleet. They launched over 450 of their best carrier aircraft, Zeros, Judy, dive bombers, and Kate torpedo planes, to destroy the American carriers. It was the largest carrier versus carrier battle in history, and it was a massacre. But it was not a massacre of the Americans. The American Navy pilots, flying their new F6F Hellcats, were not the green, terrified pilots of 1942. They were now seasoned, confident veterans, and they were flying a machine built with the cheat codes. They did not dogfight the Zeros. They did not turn with the fins at them. They climbed above them, and then they boomed and zoomed. The American pilots dived again and again and again out of the sun. Their 50 caliber machine guns, firing in short, devastating bursts, tore into the flying bomb wings of the Zeros. The Japanese pilots, who were still trying to fight a turning war, were helpless. Their Zeros, which had been invincible just 2 years before, were now exploding in mid-air, one after another, in clouds of orange flame and black smoke. A Hellcat pilot would dive, boom, ignite a Zero, and then use his massive 2,000 horsepower engine to zoom, climbing straight back up, high above the battle, to pick his next target. The Thach Weave was used to devastating effect. When the few skilled Japanese aces did manage to get on the tail of a Hellcat, the American pilots would weave, and the Japanese pilot would suddenly find himself in the gun sights of the other Hellcat. It was a clinical, technical slaughter. By the end of the day, the Japanese Navy had lost over 350 of its best carrier planes, and its irreplaceable, veteran ace pilots were gone. The Americans had lost just 30. The kill ratio of 1942, 10-1 against the Allies, had been reversed. The Hellcat was now achieving kill ratios of 19-1 against the Zero. The invincible myth of the Japanese Zero was broken. It was broken by a new machine and a new set of tactics that had all been born in a cold, muddy swamp on the forgotten island of Akutan. The Akutan Zero, the ghost that had been captured by Lieutenant Bill Thies, had in effect single-handedly destroyed the Japanese Naval Air Force. It had taught the Americans how to fight. It had taught the engineers what to build, and it had given the Allies the final, critical, technical key to winning the war in the Pacific. And that concludes this story about the Akutan Zero. If you want to learn more about World Duel 2, subscribe, like, and share. Also, leave your anecdotes and ideas in the comment section.